for example, title cloud and they give us a nice.
Magic. Magic. Arto, to što ono tako.
Okay, want to check? Thanks for coming. We're switching to English now. Here. First talk is going to be Dane talking about naming things. Second is going to be Otto talking about TypeScript. The last is going to be me bothering you about flame graphs, and we'll see how that goes. But first, let's give a round of applause for Dane.
Hi. So, they say there are only two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation and naming things. So why is naming things so important? Code is read way more often than it's written, and to actually give good names, you have to understand what you're trying to do. Readability of code also means maintainability. And good naming is important for public APIs so that you can discover and understand what they do. You should always be writing code for people and not for machines. So the first step in naming is to think about the problem you're trying to solve. You have to understand the problem before you can actually name things, because once you know the clear purpose of the concepts you're trying to introduce, you'll also get a clear name. You can use word definitions and Wikipedia to get a sense if a word is appropriate for something, and you can also use synonyms to find similar words that may be more important. One Google trick is that you can Google define word, and you can find the definition of the word on Google, so you see if it's appropriate for your use case. You should always avoid temporary names like X, foo, temp, because they convey no information and they give no clear indication in the code what the variable is for. Because every variable is basically temporary, so it doesn't make sense to give them temporary names. So a typical example is if you want to swap the values of two variables, you usually use something like temp. But if someone is not familiar with this particular swap, it can be a bit tricky to see what this code does and if it does what it's supposed to. So in this case, you can name it something like swap. You can also use language constructs instead, so you can avoid having to create a temporary variable in any case. One good idea is also to name your indexes. So instead of I and J, you actually name them sensibly depending on what they do. So a typical example is having a nested loop in C-like languages where you have I and J for indexes, but this doesn't really help you understanding the code because I and J looks similar. You don't really have a clear idea what they're doing, and it's easy to mix them up. But if you name them something like left index and right index, you can see that the left index goes from the start of the array to the end, and the right index goes from the end of the array to the left index. So you have a mental picture of what's going on. In a lot of cases, you can also use functional programming for this. You can use things like map, filter, and reduce to avoid having to have a for loop altogether. Naming things goes hand in hand with refactoring. So you should always be keeping your code dry. So don't repeat yourself and try to extract expressions and refactor code. So local variables are cheap, but programmers aren't. Having well-named variables will help your readability and maintainability of your code. So, for example, if we have like a if statement that checks if a user can edit an order. So it checks for multiple conditions, if the user is the merchant, and if the order belongs to this user, and if the order is editable, then do something. But this expression, at first sight, it's you have to take some time to understand what it does. So what you can do is you can extract the whole expression into a new variable that is named based on what it does. So you can say if user can edit order, and this code is much more apparent and easier to read. And once you have this extracted, you can also notice that basically you can refactor this to a method on the user object. So you can just say if user can edit order. It's also important to not be surprising when naming your concept. So you shouldn't be misleading, and you should always follow the principle of least surprise. So a method should do what it says on the tin and not something entirely different. So this is very important for public APIs. So, for example, this is a JavaScript date object, and basically what this does is creates a new date on the 1st of January of 2016 and tries to output it to console. So let's take a moment to look at what this code does. Try to read it and try to understand what it does. So I can tell you that there's no problem in the first line. Okay, so now let's have a show of hands. How many of you know what this code does? Okay, so this is what the code outputs. New Year started on 5th of 0 in the year 116. So let's have another show of hands. Who was right? Okay, so what's going on here? So getDay actually returns the day of week, with Sunday being 0. getMonth returns the month of year, but it's 0 based, so January is 0. And getYear actually returns number of years since 1900. So to actually do the right thing, you'd have to call getDate, which is confusingly named. So you call date.getDate to get the day of the year. You have to add 1 to the month, and you have to call a separate method getFullYear to get the actual year. So to be fair, this was ported from Java. Java has the same API, and they actually deprecated the whole thing in Java 6, I think. You should always be checking spelling, because checking spelling at the start is simple, but mistakes are way harder to fix later. So one notorious example of this is refer. So the HTTP spec defines something called refer, which is basically the website that sent you to the domain. But they made a mistake. Refer is spelled with 2 R's or 4 R's. But this got into the spec and they got it wrong, and now we have to use the misspelling. You should always be naming the same concepts with the same names. So you should always be consistent about using the same names for the same things. So use the names for let's say if we have a user, we should always be calling it a user. But we should also be naming different things differently. So oftentimes you have situations where you could use a word that is appropriate for a concept, but you're already using this word for another concept. And in this case, it's much better to pick another word. So for this use case, you can Google for word synonyms, and it will show synonyms of that word, so you can pick a more appropriate one. So for example, type is often used, but a lot of the time you can't use it, so you can instead use a synonym like kind. Instead of tag, you can use mark, and instead of image, you can use graphic. You should always avoid ambiguity. So a word can have multiple meanings, and these meanings can be misleading based on the context. So if they both apply to the same concept, you can mislead your reader with the multiple meanings. So in these cases, it's also appropriate to use synonyms to find a better word for this. So, for example, if we have a parking object, we can check if it's free. But what does free mean? So, is the parking free of charge, or is it available? So instead, you can use different words that means the same thing but have a more specific meaning. So you can use parking.available or parking.gratis. You should also always try to rename things when appropriate, especially when meanings of the word change, because this improves understanding of the code and avoids confusion. So this is an actual example I had. I had a admin interface that has a sort of a generic table display handler, and it had a global flag called enable sorting. But what this did is basically it allowed you to reorder the rows with the jQuery sortable plugin. That's why it was called enable sorting. But then we had a new requirement where we had to actually enable sorting on table columns. So calling the flag enable sorting would be confusing because of the different meaning of the word. So what I did is I renamed the enable sorting flag to enable reordering and used the enable sorting for actual sorting of the columns. When using opposite words, you should always find an appropriate name pair for the opposites. So you should always be using standard opposites like get set, login logout, read write, instead of get change or login sign out or input write. To find this on Google, you can use word antonym. So this means the opposite of the word. Avoid enterprising names. So this is an actual class from the Spring Framework. It's called Abstract Singleton Proxy Factory Bean. And its description reads that it's a convenient proxy factory bean superclass for proxy factory beans that create only singletons. Sounds convenient. Avoid Smurf naming. So what is Smurf naming? It's basically repeating the same word over and over again in all your mothers and classes. So based on the context, it's a lot of times it's redundant to repeat the same word because you're already in a context of another class that that uses that word. So this is something you should avoid. One good tip is also that you should make names searchable so that you can search for them in the entire project. So this is especially important in dynamic languages where you don't have tools that find usages of a particular method or variable, and you can only use search, text search over the whole project to find it. So one example is if you're running an A/B test and it's used all over the place, you can name your variable so that you can definitely find only this variable everywhere you're using it. So you can just search for A/B improved checkout and find all the places in the code where it's used. You should also never abbreviate, so never shorten words just because the long version is longer, because it's harder to read, it's harder to understand, and it's also harder to search for. So you should always be writing code for humans, not machines. Machines don't care how long your variables are, but humans do. So, for example, if we have this variable, from a first glance, it's pretty difficult to understand what it's supposed to be doing. But if you don't abbreviate, you can see that this is the currency that the user selected. It doesn't matter if it's long, as long as it's readable. You should also try to not be too generic. So avoid generic words that add no extra information like entity or object, because they don't explain your intent of what you're trying to achieve with them. So if we have a scale from specific to generic, you can see on the right side we have a Labrador, in the middle we have an animal, but on the right side we have an entity, which could be basically anything in the universe. On the other side of things, you should try to be concise. So don't be too specific, because requirements change, and after a certain point, not enough info is added to a name. So for example, I had this class called XML third-party export. It was doing data export for third-party partners via XML feeds. But then we had new requirements and new feeds. So instead of XML, we often use JSON or CSV or TSV. And it was also not always third-party. It was also used internally in other parts of the app. So instead of this, you can just call it data export. It gives you about the same amount of information, but it's way more flexible and more readable. So in cases where you have short names, but you have to add some extra info to it, add some context. So you should always try to clarify the intent of the code you're writing to avoid confusion. So for example, if we have a discount that allows you to discount your orders, it's not very clear if this discount means a percent, or does it mean an amount, or in what currency is it? So what you can do is just add extra context to it. So you can say discount percent or discount amount. So someone reading the code for the first time will immediately know, okay, this is a percent or this is an amount. There's another example. So this is a control method that did some duplication of an offer. You read an offer from an ID, and then you duplicate it into a new variable called offer2. But the problem here is that if you have some logic after it, you can quickly confuse the two, because it's not apparent, okay, you have to use the offer2, or you have to use the offer, or you can actually mix them up in the code. So instead, what you can do is add like a prefix to it. You can say old offer and new offer, and it's going to jump out to you, so you can see exactly which object you're handling. If your project has some naming conventions, you should always use them, especially if you don't agree with them. because consistency is way more important than personal preference. Other people will be reading and maintaining your code, so if you don't go following conventions, they're going to be confused when they see your code. So you should be writing for your team. So finally, you should always try to name your projects early, because the project name is used in a lot of things like project meetings, package names, API keys, marketing material, and so on. And it's way harder to change it afterwards. So if nothing else, you can use a code word that's easily searchable and easily replaceable in the project. So for an example of this, in the Java world, when they were adding the Swing UI toolkit, they assigned it to a temporary Java X namespace. The plan was always to pull it into the Java namespace, which is the default for all the libraries, but before they released it, they couldn't actually change it to Java Swing, because books and references were already printed with Java X.Swing. So they just had to keep it like that. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Shakespeare, which says, "What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." What he means by that is that even if you change the name of a rose, it will still smell nice. But here's my version of that quote. So, code by any other name would smell. Thank you. Any questions? Okay.